In Marx's third thesis, he returns to his broader critique of all previous materialism, which really kicked off the theses on Feuerbach. But here he primarily focuses his attention on a few things. First, Marx attempts to draw a connection between someone's views on human beings and their views on social philosophy. In particular, Marx is interested in the connection between a person's belief that human beings are nothing but the products of their environment and their views on what constitutes good social philosophy. A little more specifically, Marx is worried that someone who thinks you're nothing but the product of your environment will naturally be inclined to think that changing the environment is all you have to do to improve people's lives. But Marx does not think that's correct. Marx also takes this opportunity to introduce and then criticize a school of thought which we haven't discussed up to this point. And that is a school of thought which he calls utopian socialism. Robert Owen, who we'll see when we read Thesis III, is a philosopher who Marx classifies as a utopian socialist. And this term was something that is applied kind of as a derogatory one. It's a critical one that Marx and Engels kind of came up with themselves. It's not one that these philosophers would have used or embraced, most likely. But it's one which Marx has applied to them precisely because he finds their views to be untenable. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those views were that Marx found that he disagreed with. Finally, Marx advances his own view of human beings, at least in a rough way, which holds that human beings possess at least some capacity for self-determination, which would seem to preclude the notion that our environment predestines us rather than just predisposes us to do certain things and think certain things. In other words, our paths are not set in stone. Thesis 3. The materialist doctrine that men are the products of circumstances and education, and that changed men are therefore the products of other circumstances and a changed education, forgets that circumstances are changed by men, and that the educator must himself be educated. Consequently, materialism necessarily leads to a division of society into two parts, of which one is elevated above society, for example, in Robert Owen. The coincidence of the transformation of circumstances and of human activity can only be conceived and rationally understood as revolutionizing practice. So there's a few related but distinct lines of thought here. First, when Marx is talking about the materialist doctrine that men are the products of circumstances and education, what he's doing there is he's criticizing the view that human beings are really nothing more than the products of their environment. That what you do is determined by what's available for you to do. That what you think is what you've been taught to think. However, without denying the influence that someone's environment might have on their development, Marx insists that human beings possess at least some degree of self-determination. Furthermore, he seems to think that human beings are able to deviate from old beliefs and ingrained behaviors, learn new ideas, and engage in new activities. And he thinks that we can do this regardless of what our external circumstances or our upbringing happen to be or to have been. This is an interesting and exciting claim, and perhaps a surprising one, depending on what preconceived ideas we have about Marx's philosophy, which could be very varied. But it's certainly an interesting one because it seems to imply, at least that Marx thinks, that our paths are not written in stone, that we can change what we do, what we think, and who we are, which seems like a good thing, right? So we're eager to figure out how we do that. Unfortunately, Marx doesn't tell us, at least not right away. It's not clear at this point exactly how Marx thinks we are both influenced by our environment to some degree, but we're also able to deviate from what we've been taught and what we've been kind of trained or ingrained to do. It's not clear how exactly he thinks we can balance both of those things, which is not easy to do. That's not a given. To what extent are we influenced by our environment? To what extent are we free to deviate from what we've been trained or taught to do? It's not something you can just kind of throw out there without backing up with something somewhat specific. However, Marx doesn't give us a straight answer to that question just yet. Instead, for some reason, I'm not sure why, he breaks off into kind of a different line of thought. And he starts talking about a specific school of thought known as utopian socialism. The utopian socialist philosophers were pretty prevalent before Karl Marx. And in fact, if you read his economic and philosophic manuscripts, you can see Marx engaging more directly and more thoroughly with a few philosophers who would have been classed under that heading. Like Karl Marx, the utopian socialists were interested in changing things. They wanted to build philosophy around the idea of changing society. We know that's what Marx wants philosophy to do, so that should make him happy, right? Well, Feuerbach and Bauer also ostensibly wanted to change the way society was structured, and yet Marx was very critical of both of them, as we've already seen in Thesis 1 and 2. So we know that simply professing an interest in social change is not the way to win Marx's heart. The utopian socialists had a number of kind of underlying assumptions and methods by which they wanted to attain these social changes, which were fairly vague, too vague for Marx's liking, for one thing. And these underlying assumptions and methods by which they wanted to change things were really what bothered Marx the most. For example, utopian socialists seemed to have this idea that a social revolution or movement should be kind of broken up into this hierarchy where you have like the ideas guys on top and then you have like the proles on the bottom doing all the heavy lifting. And of course, who do you think gets to be on top? Well, the utopian socialists themselves. Why not? Basically, they have this idea of like, we'll be the brains of the operation, and the rest of you can be the brawn. You do all the work. One of the other things that bothered Marx about the utopian socialists was they were kind of hypocritical in at least one way. The utopian socialists are precisely the sort of materialists that Marx thinks holds to this view of human beings, that we're just the products of whatever we're put in front of. Yet the utopian socialists don't seem to think that that applies to them. Like, you are influenced by your society, you're influenced by your upbringing, but not us. No, we're able to come up with all these new and exciting ideas and theories about how society should be structured, how we can make things better, but we're able to come up with those ideas just on our own. As you can probably already see, this emphasis on ideas over, actual work kind of calls back to Thesis 1 and 2, where Marx is criticizing Feuerbach and Bauer for apparently placing a greater emphasis on theories and ideas over and above, in some cases to the exclusion of practice, of putting things, making stuff happen in the actual world that we live in, not just, writing things down on paper and saying, well, this seems very nice. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could put it into practice, and then sort of leaving it at that? Of course, we know Marx wants to take philosophy into the real material world where we live and where it will actually have an impact on us. Finally, Marx returns to his original line of thought and gives us something of an answer to our question. How exactly do people deviate from the path that's been laid out for them, presumably since birth? How does someone go from being brought up to believe something, from being brought up in a particular environment where certain activities are allowed and others are precluded? How does someone deviate from that? When Marx says the coincidence of the transformation of circumstances and of human activity, so what we're talking about, the change, that deviation, that's what we're talking about. Transforming is the word that he uses. That this can only be conceived and rationally understood as revolutionizing practice. And then in parentheses, there's our favorite word again, praxis. So what Marx seems to be saying is that it is precisely the practice of trying to change society which will provide people with these new ideas and new activities.